Good morning, everyone. My name is Kerry Chow from Cobalt HR. I'm pleased to welcome you to the session today, which is on how to manage staff who are being too flexible in their approach to work. So we've got an exciting session for you ahead. If I could just maybe ask my colleagues from Darwin Gray to introduce themselves so you know who is on the other side of the call, that would be great.
Thanks, Kerry. Good morning, everybody. My name is Damien Phillips, and I'm an employment partner in Darwin Gray. We're a commercial law firm based in central Cardiff, in Cathedral Road. And I'll pass you over to my colleague.
Morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Ford-Evans. So I also am from Darwin Gray. I'm Damien's colleague, and we both work in the employment and HR team.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So this slide just gives you some indication of some of the organisations we work with at Cobalt HR. So tend to be quite a few sport type organisations, but also small to medium private sector businesses. And some of the ones you can see there, digital marketing, digital media, accountancy, that sort of thing. We also have been doing a little bit of work with some care businesses recently, which has been a new one for us. And that's been interesting too. So the type of work we do tends to focus around performance management. So we consider ourselves a bit of a specialist around that. So we've got lots of tools in that area, and we'll talk about some of those later on. We also offer a generalist HR service, so we get to do a bit of everything really. So some of that you'll see during the session because it touches on quite a bit of what we do. So in terms of the contents of the session, this is what we were planning on covering. We always try to make our sessions practical, so I'm hoping we're going to pull that off today. So we're going to start off, as you'd expect, with a bit of an introduction to the issue. What does it mean when staff work too flexibly, and how can you identify it? Then we're going to give you a picture of our expertise in this area around what steps can you take to encourage optimal performance and behaviours. So steps could include informal solutions such as continuous conversations, check-ins, feedback, formal solutions such as having an appropriate policy, implemented a contribution development process or a performance improvement plan, and if the issue persists, following the disciplinary process. Then we've got some expert advice coming from Darwin Gray, so they're going to share some of their experiences, and they've presented some slides as well, so we can have a look at those a little later. Then we're going to look at how both companies could support you if the need arises, so we'll talk about that. Then we've got a summary and next steps, and some time for you guys to ask questions if you want to. So lots of stuff to cover, so hopefully we'll make good progress and give you some food for thought. So obviously, going back to COVID, so that all kicked off in 2020, as we know, and the number of people working from home and working more flexibly in the UK has dramatically increased. So more than half, 51% of employees say they have flexible working arrangements, and those vary. So one example would be flexi time, where people can choose what time they start and finish, but usually within some set limits. Annualized hours, where you work a set number of hours spread across the year. One of the ones that's been particularly popular recently, or has been raised quite a bit, is around compressed hours or condensed hours, where people work full-time hours in 4 days. So that's been an interesting one. And the other one, obviously, working from home. So in a survey of employees, it's one of the most wanted workplace benefits. 71% wanted flexible working when they were asked. So with the hybrid approach staying, it's important to get it right. And obviously some of those questions about the reasons for you attending are really about that. So some of the advantages of implementing flexible and hybrid working practices are well known. So the CIPD talked about job satisfaction, productivity, people feeling they can get more work done when they're at home, better work-life balance, better health and well-being, staff retention and recruitment, easier to recruit with an element of home working in it, inclusion and diversity, and for many organisations, savings in office costs as well. So those are cited as some of the key advantages, and you may well have some others as well. But on the other hand, there are some risks to implementing flexible working arrangements, such as people losing visibility, some underperformance, and losing a sense of well-being and feeling a bit excluded, maybe not so involved as they once were. So one of the challenges, for example, could be staff working too flexibly, so maybe losing that sort of structure over the day. So we're now going to look at what exactly we mean by that. So it can be various levels. For example, one company that implemented remote working as a result of the pandemic and allowed staff to work more when, where and how they wanted, have experienced some problems. And they felt as though that some employees were just taking it too far. So, for example, an employee might hit their targets and perform just fine, and the productivity is not affected, but this employee might find it hard to get hold of. This staff, their colleagues might find it hard to get hold of them when they need to, and it might take ages for them to respond to emails. So there could be a feeling that the one employee's working pattern was affecting the wider team. So in a less severe example, the manager might find it difficult to keep track of what people are doing. And we've come across this in Cobalt HR. Some clients say, well, I don't know what they're doing some of the time. And you know, that is a genuine concern. In a worst case scenario, you could find that the employee is not only hard to get hold of, but also underperforming. So hybrid working does require a higher degree of trust between the leaders and their teams. And it also needs a culture that's focused on results rather than hours worked. So you can't see this person at the desk all day. So it's just making sure that their time is focused around results and you've got a way of managing it. So for this reason, it's important to take control as an employer, figure out what degree of flexibility works best for your organisation, and manage staff who work too flexibly or in a way that affects productivity, performance, or team morale, so that positive outcomes such as trust, equality, fairness, and employee health and well-being are maintained while the business remains compliant. So what we're going to do now, we're going to share 4 tips with you, which hopefully you'll find helpful. The first one we wanted to look at was setting clear expectations for performance and conduct. So if such an issue arises, you could take the opportunity to reconsider what the organisation needs from the employee. So for example, many started to focus on measuring output instead of just logging hours. It's imperative to think about what makes the most sense for your business and develop a policy and programme that really fits your business. And often this is encompassed in a hybrid working policy. So you've got some framework there. And as a manager, you should also separate where the dissatisfaction you might have with an employee is around their work productivity or the way they're delivering. So if their style or approach is the problem, check to see if you were expecting them to work the way you do. If that's the case, it may be useful to let go of those expectations and assess their real strengths and capacities for contributing to the team's work. So often there are better ways or just different ways of getting the job done. And so just because it might be different to how we've always worked, might not necessarily be a problem. So before having a discussion with the employee about the perceived poor conduct or poor performance, it's important to check that you did everything you could to set expectations and communicate important messages about the organisation's mission, goals, work tasks, values and behaviours, expectations, tools and feedback. So for example, the team members understand why they should be available for team catch-ups or when emails should be monitored during office hours. For employees as well as managers, it's still all a bit new. So useful to have a discussion to make sure they're clear. And every employee, whether they work remotely or in the office, needs clarity around their roles and responsibilities, the expected standards and their work schedules to avoid confusion, conflict and a drop in performance. So it may seem obvious to us, but maybe it's not as obvious to the employee. So there's just starting off point really, just to check. And this all really needs to start when you recruit somebody for the first time. So set clear expectations and even timescales for task completion. Even if we didn't have people working from home, this is always good practice and should have been in place anyway. And there are tools you can use to achieve this, such as the job description and the person specification, an effective induction program, just as some examples. So once expectations, roles and responsibilities are set clear in the beginning, it's important to focus then on setting clear expectations as part of the performance management process. So tools you can use for this are the appraisal process and having documented work programs as part of that, then carrying out performance reviews. And many of you will have heard of SMART, but the latest iteration of that is SMARTer. So SMART, for those that might not know, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. But the SMARTer, the last two letters, are evaluation and review. And this is often underestimated, the importance of it. So it all links into your goal setting. There's also some digital communication tools that are useful. Some organizations use Slack and WhatsApp just to make sure people can know what's going on. And then there's online tools for workflow and task management, and also the one-to-one conversation. So around this tip, performance management should not be an imposed activity. Make sure you involve your team in the entire process to increase their buy-in and improve trust. For example, employees can take their part in shaping the goals and provide input to create realistic and motivated objectives. Another example would be letting them self-diagnose during performance reviews to help them learn to improve their own performance. This will also help you avoid micromanaging, which is a significant temptation when you're trying to be extremely clear about expectations. And we've all done it, so it's just something worth review. Tip 2 is having effective policies and processes in place. So to develop even more clarity on the expectations, we advise that employers continuously review and communicate their HR processes and procedures to ensure they support flexible working arrangements whilst enabling inclusion and well-being. Your current policies and processes might not match the new reality of work. And I mentioned earlier on about hybrid policies. Many organisations wouldn't have had them. So could there be systems in place that you're used to using that are causing part of the problem with staff working too flexibly? So, for example, is there clarity on who can work remotely, the communication methods, core availability, remote working from abroad? That's one that's come up recently for us. Expenses policies. Are you going to pay for people's electricity and gas and while they're working from home, or the telecommunications bill? Employee well-being and what work must be done in the office and what can be done remotely. So some of our clients now are putting some sort of framework around people coming in maybe for team meetings or for regular, maybe once a week catch-ups, or they have to be in the office a certain percentage of the working week. So also, is there clarity on key performance indicators? So having clear targets can offer a known goal that they can work towards to achieve and continually improve on. If it turns out the employee's performance is fine, but the issue is how they approach work and work in relationships, an option is to set out expected standards of conduct in a code of conduct, and making sure you've got that as part of your sort of framework of documents. Or you could develop a values and behaviour framework specific to your company. So it talks about how people do their job, not just what they have to do. So that would focus on things like getting the quality right first time, every time, those sort of qualities. So if these values and behaviours are lived and integrated into the recruitment, induction and performance review processes, they can provide guidance for all staff about the expected behaviours and attitudes, and it supports the delivery of the business plan, values and culture. Obviously, if you've given people that information at the start, then hopefully you won't get too many problems further down the line, but a gentle reminder might be all it needs to get somebody back on track. So one tip is to ask employees what they want. So for example, you can understand what works for employees in an employee engagement survey. So if you're not doing that now, it may be a good idea to put one in place. And if you're doing a review of policies, consult with the team, and we should be doing that anyway. And that will enable you then to understand everyone's needs, and then you can adjust your policies and practices to take those into account if possible. So often an effective flexible working policy provides clarity on how employees can apply to modify their working arrangements. And so we're going to cover that a little bit today around the flexible working changes. And we want to work in the way that's best for people to increase their productivity and well-being. That's what it's all about. So it also helps organisations to adopt a standard approach to deal with requests and situations in a consistent way. And this could also help employers stay on the right side of the law. So obviously our colleagues will cover that a little bit more a little later on. So for this reason, you might also want to consider providing managers with the training they need to manage a remote team. So some of this stuff we're covering today, it would be really valuable for them. So make sure they're not just left there to make it up for themselves. So there's legal and best practice here to ensure that hybrid working is safe, inclusive and fair. So worth bearing those things in mind for sure. So tip 3 is around communication. So don't leave people floundering, working at home, not sure what they want to do. So check-ins, feedback and continuous conversation are really important. So even if they've been on the team a long time, it's important to ask about their goals and what they care about. Then you can modify your management approach to match their needs. So for example, someone may prefer strict deadlines and structure, whereas others might benefit from more autonomy. You need to know your people. It's also important to provide effective feedback. Many people who aren't doing well have a vague feeling that something is wrong, but don't actually know which of their behaviours are not working. So for example, telling an employee to be more proactive may not help them understand specifically what they need to do differently. So it's helpful to discuss specific examples and allow them to practice modifying those behaviours. If you notice any inconsistency between the expected and delivered standards, it's often advised to act early and nip it in the bud. It can be risky to wait until you're back in the office to provide the support they need. It could be maybe a week wasted if you hold back on giving that feedback. So it can take a gentle form by checking in to see how the employee is doing, and it can save a lot of time and energy further down the line. So performance management and development are more effective when you understand your employees and their differences. It's vital to develop strong, respectful, productive and positive relationships, even across virtual boundaries. Again, it's about knowing your people, what makes them tick, how they best work. On the other hand, it's important to consider any external factors that could be impacting the employee. So they could be ill. We think they're working away and maybe they're unwell, so we need to know. They could be suffering from stress. It might not be anything to do with work, but if they're stressed, then as a manager, we need to know. They could have anxiety about change ways of working or anything that may have contributed to the conduct or performance that's perceived to be a problem. So these could all be revealed through effective communication. When people are overwhelmed, it's important to support them, and you can't do that well unless you really know what makes them tick and how they feel. The tip 4 is on performance management. If you suspect that the underperformance difficulties come from insufficient experience, skill gaps, or lack of business acumen, there are some performance improvement tools you can consider. For example, if the underperformance continues following the informal discussion, you might consider putting in place a contribution development process a positive version of the performance improvement plan of, say, 6 weeks to improve both the output and how the employee approaches work. This could be followed by another 6 weeks to sustain the changes. Hopefully the issues are resolved at this point and will not have to lead to any disciplinary or capability process. So one tip we present in this area would be presenting a personal improvement plan as a helpful tool for personal growth. So often they're used when there's a perceived performance issue and to help people back on track, but they could be seen in a positive light. So having a positive approach can help both parties. So for example, a helpful dialogue could go a long way, such as, Tom, it looks like you're short of your sales targets again this week. How do you think you're doing? We've had a chat about this before and not much has changed. How do you think we should deal with this moving forward? So hopefully you've got them on side and together you can come up with some solutions. So these conversations can turn into a disciplinary matter, or they can turn a disciplinary matter into a self-improvement project. So it's about being honest with them, being authentic and having that discussion about what change needs to happen and getting their ideas. And that'll be really helpful in terms of making sure people stay engaged and carry on contributing and get them working to support what you're trying to do. So those are the 4 tips I wanted to share with you. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleagues in Darwin Gray. So I think Rachel's going to cover the first one. So if I hand over to her, that's brilliant.
So Damien and I are just going to whiz through some of the legal pitfalls that can arise out of all of this, because of course flexible working, as Kerry said, it's a benefit that most employees want to have, and it's a benefit that very many employees have had over the last couple of years. So if employers want to think about withdrawing or amending the terms of a flexible working arrangement that's in place, that's going to become potentially very contentious, and employees aren't going to like that. So we're going to talk about the legal implications of that and how disputes can be avoided and dealt with if they arise. So we're going to start off with the contractual issues that come out of all of this. Of course, over the last 2 years, people have been working differently, and that may or may not have been reflected in their employment contracts. Most of you as employers hopefully will have written employment contracts in place for your staff, and in fact that is a legal requirement under Section 1 of the Employment Rights Act. You have to give certain written terms to your employees in a Section 1 statement. It may be the case that you've amended those contracts during COVID through contract variation letters to say, for example, that people are permitted to work from home or that their hours can be amended. It may be the case that you haven't ever done that in writing, but you've just allowed that to happen. So people have in practice started working differently, and in many cases that's just carried on after lockdown for probably much longer than most of us would have expected. So the question then becomes, at what point do these changes to people's original working arrangements as set out in their contracts become implied terms? It is possible for that to happen through what's called custom and practice. If people have been working in the same way for a long time, no one said anything to them to the contrary, and both the employer and the employee have started just acting on the understanding that that will be the case, and that, for example, someone will be allowed to work from home, either full-time or part-time, or that they will be allowed to work flexible hours. It's possible for that to become an implied term of the contract of employment. Now, the best way of avoiding that happening is through a very good written contract that sets out clearly what the terms are, and if it is amended, through a decent contractual variation letter. But it can still happen that a term can form part of the contract through custom practice without being written down. If that is the case, or if you have a term in someone's contract that you no longer want to apply or you want to be amended, you need to think about whether it's possible and how to go about changing a term of someone's contract. Now, that's not easy because a contract of employment is a two-way thing. It's a two-way relationship. It's not just the case that the employer's word is law when it comes to the contract of employment. A term of someone's contract can only safely be amended through agreement with the employee. And the way to achieve that is through consultation. So a consultation process should involve you communicating with the employee, telling them what change you would like to make and why, sitting down with them and having a meaningful discussion about that and about their views on it, and really taking on board what they say. That might be through a series of meetings. If you've got lots of people involved, it might have to be done through trade unions or employee representative bodies, but I won't go into that now because that's a much bigger topic. But the consultation process is absolutely key in changing a contract of employment for the purpose of reaching agreement. If you can't reach agreement through consultation, you will then need to be thinking about whether you just want to impose a change without the employee's consent. Now, that's a difficult thing to do because it can be viewed as a fundamental breach of someone's contract of employment, and it can lead to a constructive unfair dismissal claim. So it is risky, and ideally you want to be changing someone's contract with their agreement after a meaningful consultation process. If a working arrangement is non-contractual, so the contract is clear, but it's just that somebody has been working in a different way, not really for long enough for it to become a custom and practice issue, but they're getting a non-contractual flexible working benefit. It's slightly easier to change that because it isn't a contractual term, so you don't necessarily have to have their agreement to that. But the caveat in UK employment law is that everything that an employer does towards their employees has to be done reasonably. Otherwise, again, you're potentially looking at breaching their contract of employment, that duty of trust and confidence that you've got towards your employees, and you might start facing grievances or even claims for constructive dismissal. So everything that you do should be done in a reasonable way. I would say that even if you're not looking at a contractual term, you should sit down and consult with the employee over what you're intending to do with their working arrangements anyway. And other aspects of being reasonable would include giving them enough notice of any changes. So not just saying, I want you back in the office as of tomorrow, or I want you working these hours. You need to give them plenty of notice, and you need to talk through with them what the consequences for them might be. So if you get it wrong, as I said, you could be looking at a constructive unfair dismissal claim. You could also be looking at potential discrimination claims, which Damien's going to talk about on the next slide. And the best way of avoiding this type of dispute is really through having a very good, strong contract of employment in place, supplemented by clear written policies and rules. And if you do make changes to people's contracts, including their working arrangements, by giving them a written contractual variation letter and making sure they acknowledge that and ideally sign it. Okay, can we have the next slide? And I'll hand over to Damien.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I mean, the obvious answer when if staff are working too remotely is to think, right, well, let's just get everyone back into the office, back into the workplace. And it does seem that there's a real split at the moment. You see in the press where some employers are now saying, actually, you know, we've had 2 years of this and we don't think it's working, whereas others are really embracing it and saying, yeah, it is working. And I think the practical reality of it is it is going to be here to stay, simply from a recruitment and retention point of view. As Kerry said at the outset, it is the biggest benefit that staff want to have. And as an employer, if you're not going to offer it, then you will lose your existing staff and you won't be able to recruit replacements. So you know, it's got to be managed. If you've got someone who you feel is being difficult, and you say, right, well, we're going to have to look at this, we're going to have to manage you, we're going to have to, you know, potentially bring you back into the office, even if it's, say, for a temporary period of time, or if you want to reduce the number of days that they have been working away from the office. Rachel's touched on the potential contractual issues, but another issue is potential discrimination. And the two obvious protected characteristics are sex and disability, and it may be because of those protected characteristics that a particular person needs the ability to work flexibly, including from home. it could be reduced hours as well. It's not necessarily just working remotely. It may be hours because of parental responsibility, for example. And in that situation, indirect sex discrimination will often apply. It's established that more women than men have childcaring responsibilities. So if an employer applies a provision criterion or practice, a PCP, that disadvantages somebody with a particular protected characteristic over somebody who doesn't have that protected characteristic, that could amount to indirect discrimination. So in the case of women, if they're being told that they can't work fewer hours or they can't work from home, then that could potentially be indirect sex discrimination. It is capable of being objectively justified, but it would fall on you as the employer to do that. I mean, conversely, it could actually be direct sex discrimination for men. For example, if you had a father with childcare responsibilities, and basically a request to work part-time, for example, was refused, he might say, well, if I was a woman, you would allow it, so therefore it's direct sex discrimination. So that's something to bear in mind as well. The same is true of disability discrimination. There is an obligation not to indirectly discriminate, again, through provision criterion or practice that may have an adverse effect on a disabled person's ability to comply with that PCP. But also there is the obligation to make reasonable adjustments to facilitate the disabled person's ability to perform their job properly. So again, that may mean they work from home. There may be difficulties in travelling to and from the place of work. I mean, I'm sure they are things that you're familiar with. You should be familiar with them, but it's something to bear in mind if you suddenly think we need to change the way people are working and we need to bring them back into the office or back into the workplace. As I say, it is possible to justify it, but you will need to give proper thought to that, and you'll need to communicate that to the employees and let them understand why it is necessary. Another potential disability claim is under Section 15 of the Equality Act, which is discrimination because of somebody's disability. And again, that is where someone is treated unfavourably in consequence of their disability. There's something arising in consequence of their disability. So that can be objectively justified. But there's potentially 3 heads of claim for a disabled person under the Equality Act by you saying we need to bring you back into the office. We've got harassment and bullying claims as well. And I think that is something that I hope wouldn't be an issue. But it is possible that you have employees who don't want to return to the workplace, not because they're just having a nice time at home, but because they're afraid of coming back to the workplace, because there's been a culture of where they've been bullied and harassed by colleagues. And so working from home is effectively a place of sanctuary for them. So hopefully that is not an issue, but if it is, then that's something you need to address. It's possible to be vicariously liable for harassment claims. Harassment, it's often, there's a misconception with harassment that people say, oh, I'm being harassed. Harassment is a statutory claim under the Equality Act. Harassment takes place because of a protected characteristic. It is where someone is subjected to unwanted conduct that has the purpose or effect of violating their dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. And it is because of a protected characteristic. You should have policies in place that deal with that, because if you do, then you can potentially have a statutory defence against any such claims. But it's not just good enough to have a policy saying we have a dignity at work policy, we have an equal opportunities policy, everybody's treated fairly, no one is discriminated against because of a protected characteristic. There needs to be training on that, it needs to be regular, the message needs to be enforced all the time. And if you don't do that, the statutory defence will fail. Bullying, there is no standalone bullying claim. It is not a statutory matter. There is no legal definition of bullying. ACAS does have a sort of generic definition of bullying. It is what we would expect it to be, but it can manifest itself in many ways. It's not just a case of shouting at somebody or hitting somebody. It can be ignoring them. It can be deliberately giving them too much work, setting them up to fail, overlooking them for promotion. It can take all passive aggressive behaviour. It can take many forms. But if you do have someone who's reluctant to return to the workplace, then try and find out why. If you feel they need to come back, and if it turns out that it is because of potential harassment or bullying, then you need to take steps to address it. Part-time workers' rights. Again, that's just something to flag up. It may be, for example, that an employer decides to operate a blanket policy whereby they say 3 days in the workplace, 2 days at home. That's the maximum. You can only have 2 days at home. You have a part-time employee who only works 3 days a week, and you say, well, you work 3 days a week. Our policy is you've got to be in the workplace 3 days a week, so therefore you can't have any days at home. That would potentially be less favourable treatment on the grounds of being part-time. And the obvious thing to do would effectively pro rata. So if it's 60% for a full-time person has to be in the workplace, then you can pro rata it accordingly for the part-time worker. But again, on the basis that it works for the business. Everything you do has to work for your business, but if you're getting things right, then it should be possible to manage it all properly and keep everybody happy. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So flexible working requests. I'm sure that's something again that you're familiar with, and hopefully you'll have a formal policy setting out flexible working requests. It is a statutory right to make a flexible working request. Basically, it will only apply to employees. It doesn't apply to workers, and it only applies after 26 weeks of continuous employment. That's when the statutory right arises. And essentially, an employee can make a written request to work flexibly, and that can mean working from a different location, working different hours, and the like. They have to explain the basis of their request, and they also have to explain how they believe it will impact on the business and why it should work for the business. As an employer, you then have 3 months in which to respond, and there are 8 statutory reasons to refuse the request, and they're pretty wide. For example, the additional cost, concerns about a drop in performance, inability to recruit additional staff to potentially cover any difference in hours, for example, if somebody wants to go part-time. And the reality is it's probably pretty easy for an employer to justify a reason to refuse it. But obviously, again, the concern is that you will lose that member of staff. So there's nothing in the rules that says that you can have a trial period, but my advice would be try and agree a trial period, see how it goes, and ultimately, if it doesn't work, then you can turn the request down. But still don't forget the potential discrimination that I've mentioned, that could still apply. There's got to be a right of appeal from any refusal. But the other thing to bear in mind, and that's, I think it's something that employees often overlook as well, is that it leads to a permanent contractual change. So this is not a temporary measure. So once that change is agreed, if the employee's circumstances change, maybe in a year or two, and they decide, actually, I'd like to go back to my original working arrangement. If as an employer, you've made contingencies to deal with any shortfall, you may have recruited somebody else part-time, then that might not be possible. So that's something that they need to be aware of and communicated to them as well. And I think it's back to Rachel.
Thank you, Damien. So for our last slide, I just want to talk to you quickly about data protection and privacy issues. I won't spend too long talking about this. It's actually a topic that we could probably spend a whole session dealing with because it's pretty complex. But I'm just going to give you a summary because there will be employers out there who are concerned about some of the issues that Kerry was talking about earlier with, for example, employee visibility or measuring productivity with people working remotely, and want to be able to monitor what employees are doing for the purpose of measuring productivity and checking that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now, we've seen some pretty extreme examples in the press of things like employers watching employees through their webcams or taking photos of them every 10 minutes or taking screenshots, monitoring their keyboard strokes and things like that. Hopefully most of you don't feel the need to go to measures quite so extreme as that, but you may still want to, for example, have the right to look at the emails that employees are sending or look at their Teams messages and conversations and things like that, just for the purpose of checking what they're up to, or to look at something specific if a concern arises. Whether you can do that under GDPR is really going to depend on whether you've got the right paperwork in place, essentially. Employees' emails and personal messages are likely to either contain or amount to their personal data, so you're going to need to be careful about this under GDPR and the Data Protection Act. And the privacy notice here is absolutely key. So all organisations, which will be data controllers, should have a privacy notice in place for their staff, setting out the types of personal data that might be processed, the ways in which you might process those, and the reasons or the lawful reasons why you do that. So you need a privacy notice which states that you might monitor employees' work, so their emails and their messages and so on. It's important to state that in writing and make sure that everyone reads that privacy notice, and ideally ask them to confirm to you that they have read it. And you also need to set out in as much detail as possible in that privacy notice why you want to do that. So there are certain grounds under GDPR for you being allowed to process personal data. The key ones here are going to be performing a contract with the employee, possibly complying with your legal obligations, but also doing so in a legitimate interest of your business. Now, if you're relying on a legitimate interest ground, you need to make sure that you carry out a kind of balancing exercise between the interests of your business, but also the rights and freedoms of your employees. So you should only do that in a proportionate way, and you should set out, again, in a privacy notice, what the legitimate interest is that you're relying on and why it's necessary to do that. So that should all be included in the privacy notice, and that will go a long way to helping you comply with your data protection obligations. Now, you will also sometimes see people complaining about human rights and saying that you reading their emails is a human rights issue, it's a breach of their privacy, etc. Actually, in employment law, human rights doesn't come into it so much in terms of the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights, because it's not really possible to sue a private employer for breach of the Human Rights Act, particularly not in the employment tribunal. But it can still be a breach of privacy, which can amount to, again, as I talked about earlier, a breach of the duty of trust and confidence under the employment contract. So if you are monitoring people's data without their knowledge, that is very likely to be a breach of trust and confidence if you haven't told them about it before in a clear privacy notice or in some other form. So it's very important that you don't just assume that you have the right to look at whatever they're doing, that you have all of the right paperwork and policies in place before you do anything like that. And also, overall, it's important to do everything in a proportionate way. So don't just go to town on employee monitoring. Think carefully about whether and why you need to do that and tell employees about it. And I think that's all that we need to say about that issue at the moment.
So in summary, it's not easy to work with a remote employee who isn't performing well, but we think at the end of the day, managers should approach the problem as if the shoe were on the other foot and keep work human. If you get it right, you can avoid legal problems, optimize their performance and improve the working relationship. So it just means putting a bit of thought into it and not being emotional about it. So in terms of how we can help you, so Cobalt HR has lots of different systems that we can use. Oh, there we are. Sorry, my screen is just frozen on me, which is really helpful. So we could help you by sort of reviewing your job descriptions, your policies, providing some training to the line managers. We talked about that earlier on. Helping set up some sort of performance management system so people are really clear what they need to deliver on. Make sure that all the information that employees need is communicated effectively. And Rachel talked about contracts earlier on. Maybe yours needs review, so I'm sure either company could help you with that. But importantly, one of the things we put a lot of time in and effort into is getting the values and behaviours right. So people may not think there's a problem. And if the manager thinks there's a problem, sometimes it just needs a bit of working together and communication. So if you're looking for some advice or think some support there, or particularly training for your line manager would be helpful, we'd be happy to work with you. So please get in touch and then we can have a conversation about how we can best help. Would Rachel like to comment in terms of Darwin Gray support?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, I mean, it's all there on the slide, but just to say that, as I said earlier, the paperwork is absolutely crucial when dealing with contractual issues, but also data protection issues, and we can certainly help you to get the right paperwork in place. If things do become difficult and you start thinking about discrimination, complaints or disputes, we can help you with that as well. And if the worst came to the worst, we act regularly in employment tribunal claims, so we can certainly help you to either avoid or deal with those.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So thanks everyone for attending today. We really appreciate it and it's been great to see you. Obviously it's a tricky topic, very much timely. So lots of organisations, as Damien mentioned earlier, now sort of thinking about well, how do we end up with the right permanent system after the crisis of COVID. And so hopefully some of what we covered will have been really helpful to you. So we're going to send you the slides. We've obviously, we mentioned taking a recording. We're going to send you that as well, just in case there's something you want to review further. We're also going to provide you with a list of the further reading, just in case you want to give it some further thought. And we'll be sending you an evaluation form. We would really encourage you to provide some feedback as we're trying to get these sessions as helpful as possible. And we're eager to learn. So please, if you could send that back, we'd really appreciate it. We're also going to send you a freebie on questions for managers to ask in one-to-one meetings. Often managers do struggle with this, you know, how do you explain something without getting into trouble? So some questions hopefully should be helpful to you. And we're also going to provide some information on further training and webinars that we'll be running over the next few months. So these may be helpful to you as well. Obviously our webinars, as you know, we don't make a charge for those. The training is just a small charge, but it's an investment. And if the topics are helpful to your managers, then it would be good to provide some further training for them. So just ending on a little bit of humour. So which we tend to do with our sessions. So some people think that their family and friends see him just sat there with a coffee all day. Some people think that the employee is just like sat there on Netflix or some other tool. We might think that we're working our socks off, and the actual reality may be somewhere in between, or putting our head down on the desk. So it's about finding out. But anyway, a bit of humour we thought we'd share with you. It's been great to see you all, and we've really enjoyed having you with us today. So when we send you information out, please sign up for a further event in the future, because it'd be good to sort of see how you're getting on. And obviously, if you need any support, the guys from Darwin Gray and ourselves, we'd love to work with you. So just please get in touch. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.